If you've been following the news recently, you might have come across 3 stories that I find really interesting and want to take a closer look at. What am I talking about? I'm talking about a potential new conflict in the Middle East that would be another proxy war between China, Russia, and the US. The 3 main stories are all connected to Saudi Arabia and the petrodollar. It all started at the beginning of 2022 when Saudi Arabia declared that it would begin trading oil with China in the Chinese currency. That announcement alone raised eyebrows, but later in the year, Saudi Arabia went against Big Daddy America and said it wouldn't increase but actually decrease oil production after Biden asked personally. This was a big blow to Biden and didn't help the current inflation issues plaguing the US. The third news story has been swirling around recently about Saudi Arabia wanting to join the BRICS nations, which include Russia and China. As a good red-blooded American, that sounds like a recipe for regime change if you ask me. Those people need some good old freedom. Jokes aside, in this video I want to dive a little deeper into the potential conflict and also talk about what it could mean for the petrodollar and US hegemony around the world. To start, we first have to have a little history lesson. After World War II, the majority of the world's gold supply was held by the United States. The US agreed to redeem any US dollar for its value in gold if the other countries pegged their currency to the dollar. This agreement was ratified by other nations in the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. It made the US dollar the de facto reserve currency. After this agreement, on February 14, 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt initiated an alliance with Saudi Arabia. This alliance was the beginning of the petrodollar. Saudi Arabia would agree to sell oil in US dollars, and the US promised to defend Saudi Arabia. There's a lot more to it, and many more agreements were signed throughout the years, but this is the basic idea. The US basically controlled the world's energy market and currency, and Saudi Arabia had a free pass to do as they pleased, which is why you rarely see articles attacking the Saudis for human rights violations or international crimes. As long as OPEC and the Saudis trade oil in USD, nobody gets hurt. So what happens when a country decides to sell oil in their own currency or in another currency? Well, usually that country needs some freedom or sanctions. Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, Libya, Syria, China, Russia, and now Saudi Arabia are all countries that have considered or tried to sell oil in other currencies. If you look at that list, you might start to see a pattern. Why is Saudi Arabia considering to sell oil to China in renminbi? According to the Wall Street Journal, Saudi Arabia is in active talks with Beijing to price some of its oil sales in yuan, a move that would dent the US dollar dominance in the global petroleum markets and mark another shift by the world's top crude exporter towards Asia. To price even a small portion of Saudi Arabia's daily oil exports of over 6.2 million barrels in a currency other than the dollar would represent a significant shift. Around 80% of all oil sales worldwide are conducted in dollars. And since 1974, the Saudis have only traded oil in dollars as part of an agreement with the Nixon administration that offered security guarantees for the country.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
There are a few reasons that Saudi Arabia might want to move away from the United States, and one of the biggest ones is China is now the largest importer of Saudi oil. Saudi Arabia was China's top crude supplier in 2021, selling around 1.76 million barrels a day, followed by Russia at 1.6 million barrels a day, according to data from China's General Administrations of Customs. In contrast, the US only imported around 500,000 barrels a day in December 2021. According to the US Energy Information Administration. If we go by the old adage that the customer is always right, then it isn't surprising that Saudi Arabia is starting to shift away from the United States into its biggest client, China. Along with the economic reasons for backing China, the Saudis aren't happy with the United States on a number of topics. According to reports, the Saudis are angry over the US lack of support for their intervention in the Yemen civil war, and over the Biden administration's attempt to strike a deal with Iran over its nuclear program. And Saudi officials have said they were shocked by the US withdrawal from Afghanistan last year, not to mention the tension between President Biden and Prince Mohammed. Biden accused the prince of being directly involved with the killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. All these issues could lead to our next story that angered the United States. According to the New York Times, as President Biden was planning a politically risky trip to Saudi Arabia this summer, His top aides thought they had struck a secret deal to boost oil production through the end of the year. Biden went through with the trip, but Saudi Arabia and Russia steered OPEC in voting to slash oil production by 2 million barrels a day. The opposite of the outcome the administration thought they had secured, as the US struggles to deal with inflation and high gas prices. A flurry of accusatory statements were exchanged between the two governments as a result of the trip, which enraged Biden administration officials and caused them to reevaluate America's relationship with the kingdom. The White House even claimed that Saudi Arabia was assisting Russia in its conflict in Ukraine. Which brings us to story number 3. Multiple sources are reporting that Saudi Arabia is looking to join BRICS. During his visit to Riyadh, President Ramaphosa of South Africa announced that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman expressed the kingdom's desire to join BRICS. The Saudis aren't the only ones interested in joining. There are other countries like Turkey, Egypt, Argentina, among others, who have expressed interest in joining. Currently, BRICS represents more than 40% of the global population and nearly a quarter of the world's GDP. And if it is expanded, it will help by bolstering the BRICS bloc's global influence. Obviously, China would love to trade oil in renminbi. It would help with investments in China and also help stabilize the currency. Russia would love for the Saudis to join BRICS because it would garner more support for their actions in Europe and shore up the energy markets. But what does Saudi Arabia gain from moving away from the United States? What I just talked about was the news reports and what are actually happening. What I want to talk about now is my opinions on why it's happening and some thoughts about the stories. I think there are two likely scenarios. One, Saudi Arabia is looking to rebalance their relationship with the US. They aren't happy with the current situation and sense weakness from the US leadership. They have no real intention of ditching the relationship, but they are showing Washington that they have other trading partners and options if the US is unwilling to help with Saudi's domestic and global affairs. This is the most likely scenario in my mind because the Saudis still gain a lot from being partners with the United States. Ideally, they will court both sides for as long as possible because they benefit from both relationships. Another possibility is that Saudi Arabia is looking to the future and where the growth markets are, and they're truly looking to move away from the United States. This would be a radical shift away from the US in the current global order, which would have severe ramifications moving forward. They might think that moving quickly while the US is perceived as weak is their best chance to break away from their relationship with the US and create new partnerships with less restrictive countries. If we're moving to a multipolar world where each region is dominated by a local power, Saudi Arabia might be looking to dominate the Middle East with partners that are more supportive of their goals. Russia would be looking to dominate Europe, China would dominate Asia, and other BRICS nations would dominate their respective regions. This would be a radical shift away from US domination where local players fall in line behind the US. And that brings us to our next point. How would this affect the United States and the petrodollar? The reason you clicked on this video was because I teased regime change. That piqued your interest and you wanted to know more. So let's take a look at that list again of nations that tried to sell oil in other currencies. Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, Libya, Syria, China, Russia, and now Saudi Arabia. How many times has the US invaded Iraq? That is an easy one to understand. In October 2000, Iraq insisted on dumping the US dollar, the currency of the enemy, for a more multilateral euro. How many sanctions does Iran have on it? Iran wants to recover billions of dollars it is owed and is billing new crude sales in euros. What is happening in Venezuela? According to reports, Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez declared on May 16, 2006 that Venezuela would consider selling oil in euros. His comments came after Iran had announced that it too was contemplating switching to the European currency. How is Libya doing these days? It used to be the richest country in Africa. US NATO intervention was allegedly taken on humanitarian grounds after reports of mass atrocities, but human rights organizations questioned the claims after finding lack of evidence. What actually happened was Gaddafi was removed from power after floating ideas of a single gold-backed currency for Africa called the gold dinar. It is significant that in the months running up to the UN resolution that allowed the US and allies to send troops into Libya, Gaddafi was openly advocating the creation of a new currency that would rival the dollar and the euro. In fact, he called upon African and Muslim nations to join an alliance that would make the new currency, the gold dinar, their primary form of money in foreign exchange. They would sell oil and other resources to the US and the rest of the world for the gold dinar. Syria is another good example. According to news reports, Syria has switched all of its state foreign currency transactions to euros from dollars amid a political confrontation with the United States. The switch would mean euro pricing for crude oil sales a major foreign currency earner for Syria. That only leaves Russia and China on our list, and both nations have had to deal with trade wars and sanctions for many years now. How many stories have you read about human rights violations which oftentimes amount to little or nothing after international rights groups investigate? How will the US respond to Saudi Arabia possibly moving off of the petrodollar? If history teaches us anything, the US will most likely move to counter Saudi Arabia. This could look like military or financial support for players in the region that are hostile to the Saudis. The Yemen civil war could spill over into Saudi Arabia. Iran could be encouraged to take more actions, or Israel or Qatar or a number of other players in the region could be backed or encouraged to act. Will this happen? Probably not, but it will be interesting to see how it plays out over the next few years. This is obviously a complex issue, and I've only scratched the surface of it in this video. Having worked in the oil industry for a few years, I find it really interesting, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Is it a smart move for Saudi Arabia to try and move off the US dollar? Do you think we'll see more trade in renminbi? Do you think China will benefit from this, or will the US counter and end up hurting China? Let me know in a comment below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this.